Okay, I think we're live. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the sixth Sherpa free lesson. Sorry there wasn't one last week. The C word, the COVID, struck our tutor down. But we're back with a vengeance. And so this week's lesson is going to be conducted by Rosa here. It's going to be on A-Level English. It's going to be language change and geographical mobility. Went straight over my head, but I'm sure she'll explain it wonderfully. So over to you, Rosa.
Alrighty, so hello, I'm Rosa, and as mentioned, I'm going to be talking about language change and geographical mobility. Here, I'll focus on second dialect acquisition so that I have something, more concrete to talk about. So before we start, it's useful to just define some of the terms. So by geographical mobility, I'm referring to relocation from one locale to another. So basically, when somebody moves from one area to another area. Um, and then second dialect acquisition is when individuals acquire or start to speak with a dialect that is not their native dialect, so not the dialect that they originally grew up speaking. So one thing that is also really important to define is what a dialect is, because this is a very broad and difficult topic that there's never-ending arguments over the precise definition of. So a dialect is a form of a language spoken by people in a geographical region or demographic group. So you could have, Norfolk English dialect, or in the US, you might have like African American vernacular English. But they're all mutually intelligible. So even if they have differences, people who speak different dialects can understand each other. But they do have differences in grammar and vocabulary. So, for example, I speak standard North American English, and I would say something like, "Oh, I have just gotten up." But someone who speaks standard British English would probably say, "Oh, I just got up." Or I would say, "I will do that in the future," versus standard British English would say, "I will do that in future." And vocabulary, likewise, I would say flashlight versus torch, or parking lot versus car park. But, I don't have difficulty understanding people who speak standard British English and vice versa. And then dialects are also, they're often associated with or tied to an accent or pronunciation. This isn't always the case, and that's also part of a bigger discussion that I would love to go into detail further with if somebody is interested in exploring this topic more, but it's outside of the purview of this at the moment. So in second dialect acquisition, individuals are exposed to and immersed in a population that speaks a different dialect. And this is related to geographical, or can be related to geographical mobility, because if you move from one place that speaks one dialect to another place that speaks a different dialect, you're surrounded by people who speak differently than you. And so in reaction to this, some individuals might change the way they speak, where they adapt to the new dialect. And it can affect both vocabulary and pronunciation, or just one of the two. If it's just one of the two, or if it's just in progress, oftentimes vocabulary will be one of the first things that will start to change. And it exists on a spectrum. So people may come to sound like native speakers of the second dialect, or they might just acquire a few features of it. But also something to keep in mind is sometimes people do the opposite, and they'll emphasize their original or foreign accent or dialect. I should have put dialect there, not accent, but yes. And I will go over those. These will come back as themes as I continue. So I guess this is kind of small, but there are, I guess, two primary methodologies to try to explore second dialect acquisition. One is to record mobile speakers, geographically mobile speakers, before or immediately after they move from an area that speaks one dialect to another, and then periodically record them over time. So the advantage of this is you can really see what changes happened to this individual specifically, the rate at which it happened, what time in their life it happened. But obviously the disadvantages are it's very difficult to do this, to stay in contact with someone over this entire period of time, and to find someone, right when they move or right after. And it also gets expensive to keep all of this research going, keep it funded. So another way is comparing speech samples or recordings from mobile speakers to recordings from people, native lifelong residents of an area that speaks their first dialect, or D1, and the second dialect that they're exposed to, or D2. Or just one of the two, depending on what you have available. So, for example, you take a speaker that moved from, California to Scotland, and you compare their speech to someone born and raised in Scotland, or compare their speech to someone born and raised in California. So the advantage is that this is obviously a lot easier. You don't have to keep in contact with someone for a long period of time. But then the drawback is, you can't, you wouldn't know exactly how they sounded before. A mobile speaker would have sounded before they moved, because no one obviously sounds exactly the same. And you don't know the rate at which these changes are happening for them, when they happened, etc. But it is a lot more realistic in terms of what people are able to do. So then you might ask, what's the importance of this? Why would we do this? Like, cool, that's interesting, but what does it contribute? So this adds to an understanding of language change and variation in individuals in both the short and the long term. So you can explore a range of factors that might contribute to language change. You have physiological, social, language input, and this is relevant to like language acquisition. How do people acquire language, the rates, the ages that they do, and likewise, phonetics of different regions, different dialects, and phonology in terms of what kind of underlying representations there are of certain words or forms. And that is, again, something that is a greater topic outside what I can get into today, but also something that I'd love to explore further with someone if they're interested. But basically what it comes down to is, yes, it gives us a lot of information about, what are the factors contributing to change, because these can be relevant to language change and variation in the bigger picture as well. So, as I mentioned, I'm going to be focusing on some of the social factors that can affect second dialect acquisition. So gender is a big one. Women are more likely to adopt or accommodate to the new dialect, or D2. And then additionally, friend groups and social circles play a big role, meaning like people who are, if their friend groups all speak the dialect of the place they moved to, and they're more centrally located in this social group, maybe they're, the center of their clique, and everyone talks to them and everyone interacts with them. They're connected to everyone in this social network. They're more likely to adopt the new dialect than someone who's more peripherally located in their social group. Someone who maybe only interacts with a few people and isn't tied into their whole larger social network, such as it were. And then identity and place are also tied together. For example, if someone wants to fit in to the place they moved to, establish themselves as someone from that area, someone of that area, oftentimes that will lead to people adopting the second dialect because you want to establish yourself in that community. And then additionally, your people's positive or negative feelings towards where they moved versus where they came from. So if somebody has really positive feelings towards the place they moved, or maybe really negative feelings towards where they came from, that would make them more likely to adopt to a second dialect, and vice versa. If someone hates where they moved or really loves where they came from, they might be more likely to hold on to their original native dialect. So another thing that's important to consider as well is age. And the reason I include this will become relevant as I go on. But younger children are more likely to acquire a second dialect because childhood is the time when people have their greatest ability to learn language. If you think about people saying, "Oh, it's so much easier to learn a language," before adolescence, it's that type of thing. Your brain is more receptive to that. And then people who are really young when they move, say maybe 10 or younger, oftentimes come to sound like the native speakers of that second dialect. So this probably sounds like a lot and a lot to process and kind of abstract. So in order to kind of give you a more concrete sense of what I'm talking about and what this means in terms of the real world, I'm going to give an explanation or exploration with a case study using something that's called the Lowback vowel merger, which I'm about to explain, and investigating how that has interacted with mobility and language change. So before I go on, I'd just like you to just think about how you would say both of these words. This is if you said them the same, then you have what's called the Lowback. Your speech has what's called the Lowback vowel merger, which I have, where words like caught and like the past tense of catch, and caught like the little bed, or bought like the past tense of buy, and bought like a robot are pronounced identically. If you said them differently, then you don't have this merger. And so this comes from those two vowels, which are historically separate, merging together in phonetic and phonological space. And this merger is present in all standard Canadian English dialects and accents, but it's not present in any British dialects or accents. So every known dialect and accent of Canadian English, the speakers have this merger, but it's not present. No speakers of any British English dialect or accent have this merger, so they would pronounce these vowels separately. So the research question for this case study was, did a pair of geographically mobile twins acquire the Lowback vowel merger in their speech? So the subjects were male-female twins who came from Norfolk, England, who moved to Alberta, Canada at the age of 10. So that's in the west of Canada, for anyone who's interested. They were both 24 years old at the time of the study, and they were both currently still living in Canada at that time. They had lived there continuously from age 10 to 24. They grew up together. They moved at the same time, same household, and same school up through high school. But they did have different friends and social groups. And then what brought this study about was that they have differences in their speech, such as differences in pronunciation. So this was actually a study that I did. So my methodology was the second one that was brought up earlier in this presentation, where I recorded both of these twins reading a short passage that had a lot of instances of word pairs like caught and caught. So I got a lot of samples in different phonological environments. And then, as I mentioned earlier with that second methodology, I recorded a male who was a similar age. I think he was 25 at the time, who was from Alberta, which is where they moved, whose speech was very representative of the dialect and accent spoken in that part of Canada. So I recorded him reading the same passage to use as a comparison and kind of a reference point for the Alberta dialect. And then using these data, I acoustically analyzed the vowels and compared them, compared the twins to each other, and then compared each twin to the native Alberta speaker. So what I found was that the female twin exhibited some signs of the merger. The vowels weren't completely the same, so she didn't say the words, it wasn't like me where you can't tell the difference between them. They were still distinct, but you could see them kind of coming together a little bit. But the male twin did not have any signs of the merger. Those vowels didn't line up at all with the Alberta male. Each time he said words like this, they were always completely distinctive. It was very clear that if he was saying one word or another. So then, to kind of, again, apply what I discussed earlier, I'm going to talk about, let's think about what might account for these differences in their speech. Because obviously age isn't going to be a factor here because they were both exactly the same age. So we have to look into other things that might be playing into the differences in their speech. So gender is a pretty straightforward one. And the patterns found in this study mirrored what one would expect, where the female twin was the one who acquired some features of the second dialect. And remember that I had said earlier that women are generally more likely to adopt a new dialect if they move. Social circles, as I mentioned earlier, could likely play a part here. The female twin was much more central and integrated with her friends and her social group. And the male twin still had friends, all of whom were from Calgary, or Alberta. Calgary is in Alberta. But, he wasn't as central in the group, and it wasn't as large of a social group. So he wasn't as immersed. Socially, he wasn't as immersed in with speakers of the second dialect. And then identity and place largely, or could have played into this. The male twin didn't have negative feelings towards where he moved. but he did like maintaining a connection with his English identity, and accent was one way of doing so, because if you have the type of accent that he did, just a Southern English accent, that's kind of what a lot of international people, especially in North America, just think of, oh, that's the British accent, which is silly, but that's, how it is. So by maintaining his Southern English accent, that was a way of kind of maintaining that link with his English identity, with England, with where he's from. So we'll also bring this back to the greater question of what does this show us about geographical mobility and language change or second dialect acquisition? Kind of what was the point of going through all of this? Because obviously it relates to language change and second dialect acquisition on a bigger picture, as I mentioned. So it tells us that some inferences we can make are that geographical mobility and exposure to a second dialect is tied in with language change and variation in some individuals, but it doesn't necessarily take place in everyone. And that age is probably a factor or age has been shown to be a factor with younger people being more likely to accommodate. But not all young people will accommodate to or acquire the second dialect. The twin who is in this study was age 10. That's an age where a lot of people will come to sound like natives of the place that they moved to. But that clearly didn't happen for him. And again, age was kind of a control here because they're twins. Obviously, they're the same age. So age is a factor, but not all young people acquire the second dialect, and it's clearly not the only thing in play here. Ultimately, what I'm showing in this study is that the social factors that were present within the twins likely played a role in their second dialect acquisition or lack thereof. So a bigger takeaway is that social factors in language change, in language acquisition, in speech in general, are really important to get a full understanding of how language works, how change works. Social changes can often be overlooked, but they are, in fact, very important to a lot of these things. So that's me. Back to you, James.
Everyone else? Okay, yeah, that was excellent. Hopefully everyone found that really informative. I learned more than I was expecting to, just because didn't do A-level English and didn't even consider dialect changes, etc. We have a couple of questions, so are you happy to answer those?
Yeah, for sure.
Brilliant. Okay, let me just put them up now. Okay. So, do you have any examples of languages borrowing from another?
I'm trying to think. This wasn't.
I
This
don't think
wasn't.
this was particularly related to this, but I think
This
it's
was.
around the
But it
subject.
brings up another interesting thing that's related to geographical mobility and language change, which is called dialect leveling, which is particularly prominent in the UK and Britain in these past few decades. So borrowing isn't exactly what's happening here, but if you want to talk about dialect leveling and things like that, I am more than happy to get into that in a different lesson. That can be its whole own topic for a conversation.
Cool. Another one here. No idea what this is personally, but what is a neo Neosmic shift?
I'm not sure
Yeah, okay. Wasn't
what.
entirely sure about that one either. Um, and then someone's asking about the about Aitchison's PIDC model to do with language change. Again, not entirely sure that is personally, but do you
Yeah.
have any idea on that one?
Um, no, I don't. I mean, if I could see it written down, maybe, but it doesn't ring a bell. I haven't, like, as you can tell, like, I'm not from the UK, so I haven't done the A levels specifically, but I looked over them and what's on them.
That's all
Um,
right. Uh, Let me do a quick Google. We might as well have a look. Um, it's a good top tip for everyone studying out there. Googling. It's a profession, and should be rewarded with some uh, grades, I think. Okay, let's have a look at Aitchison's metaphors. Um, the crumbling castle view is another of Aitchison's metaphors. So 1996. Yeah, I'm not entirely sure what this question is about, but what I would suggest, if you do have any other questions, pop them into our Q&A forum. So we have a wonderful Q&A forum on Sherpa, which is open to all of our tutors. They can hop on and answer any questions that you've got. It's really quick. You'll get an answer within a couple of minutes. So questions like that seem very specific and very tailored, definitely hop on to the Q&A forum, ask away, and I'm sure there will be someone out there, tutor or not, that comes across it and that will be able to answer it for you. Okay. Unfortunately, they're the only questions that we've got, which is a bit disappointing, but it happens. Is there anything else you want to touch on, Rosa, before we finish up?
yeah, I guess just following up on the one with borrowing, it's like I said, I'm not going to get into that in detail, but that also has to do the dialect leveling and borrowing happens both with vocabulary and pronunciation, dialect, grammar. So it's actually a really interesting thing to explore that my master's dissertation is looking at in part. So I have quite a lot of information there if anyone's interested in kind of talking about that more, learning about it more, because it's, yeah, as I mentioned, particularly prominent in Britain. Um, yeah,
Excellent. Yeah.
yeah,
So, yeah, if you do want to get into more detail with Rosa about all of that, you can find the link to her Sherpa profile in the description of this YouTube live stream and video. So you can click on that. It will take you directly to her Sherpa profile. You'll be able to book in an introduction with her and then even book in a lesson with her so that you can go over all of that stuff in detail. Alternatively, if you're maybe looking for a maths tutor or a science tutor, you can log on to the Sherpa website. We've got a lovely Find a Tutor page, or you can get in touch with one of our tutor experts who will help you find the perfect tutor for you. And you can do that on 01628 337 590. I think that's pretty much it from me. So I think we'll end it there and I'll just let Rosa say bye and then we'll end the stream.
yeah, it was lovely. I guess not meeting people, but lovely trying to educate you and open your minds to some more information. And I'm not sure that probably sounded really corny, but that's
Cliches are cliches for a reason, they work.
yeah.
Okay, brilliant. Cheers, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Okay.